I'm not sure if this is a really well-known fact, but considering that I was fooled by it for quite a long time, I'm pretty sure there are certainly other people that have been fooled by it. But the fact is that if you think that this pen has an iridium tip, you're completely wrong, as was I. The idea that fountain pens actually have a tip that has any iridium in it is completely false. In fact, if you haven't used a fountain pen that was made prior to the 1950s, the chances are that you have never used a fountain pen that has actually contained a tip containing iridium. Now, the only reason why I ever bothered to look into this, because obviously this is at the very bottom of the list of stuff I would ever want to do, but the thing is, a while ago I was on the subreddit Data is Beautiful on Reddit, and I came across a graph showing the distribution of elements in the Earth's crust. And at the bottom, obviously, is all the rare earth metals, and at the very bottom is iridium. And looking closer at iridium and doing a little bit more research, I found out that the price of iridium is around about $1,400 an ounce, give or take. And this pretty much meant that this stuff is super rare and it is very, very expensive. So pretty much there is no way that I could buy 5 nibs from China for $1.50 if they actually contained iridium. So the question is, what are these nibs actually made of when they say iridium tip? So the first bit of research was from an article from nibs.com, and the cool thing about these guys is they actually sent a whole bunch of fountain pen nibs away and actually got them professionally tested to see what the actual chemical composition of the nibs was. And one of the first pens that they sent away were a whole bunch of Parker 51s, and these are very iconic fountain pens, and one of the things that they are known for is actually using fountain pens that actually had iridium tips. So the first pen that they had tested was a Parker 51 from 1952, so a little bit of an older Parker 51, and this supposedly iridium-tipped pen only had about 2.6% iridium in it, and that is a tiny fraction compared to the whole composition of the nib. It's pretty much nothing, and if you look at Parker 51 nibs that were tested from 1956 and 1957, the nibs either had 100% ruthenium nibs or a nib containing 56% ruthenium and 44% rhodium. So it looks like the Parker 51 pens famous for using iridium tips in their fountain pens were either completely phased out of using iridium or in the process of getting rid of iridium, replacing them with materials that were very similar in physical properties because they are both members of the platinum group, but these materials are certainly a lot cheaper. Well, ruthenium is certainly a lot cheaper than iridium. So pretty much to get a pen with a sizable chunk of iridium in the tip, you really need to look at older pens. So if you look back at the 1920s, you can find pens that have more iridium in it. So another pen that they tested was a 1929 Parkerjar Fold, which was a very expensive pen at the time and still is. This pen here had a nib tip that was made of 38.4% osmium, 29% ruthenium, and 32.5% iridium. So pretty much an expensive pen from the 1920s only had about 1/3 of its nib tip comprising of iridium, and it wasn't even the highest composition metal in the nib tip. So really, you'd want to call it an osmium-tipped fountain pen. Now, nibs.com did list a few other pens that they had tested, but the Parkerjar Fold was pretty much the pen that had the largest composition of iridium in the tip. So I'll certainly link that below, but that's pretty much where the story ends from nibs.com. So I had to do a little bit of other research to find out if other pens actually used 100% iridium. And after doing a little bit more research, I stumbled across a PDF of a history of iridium from 1987. So it looks like, according to this book, that 1834 seems to be the earliest recorded time that iridium was attached to a nib, and this was done by John Isaac Hawkins in 1834, who attached a 100% iridium ball to a gold nib. And this is actually one of the first uses for iridium, because iridium was only discovered in 1803, and it took them 9 years to be able to actually figure out how to produce a high enough temperature to melt the stuff. And for for a long time they didn't really have much use for this super dense, super hard metal until obviously 1834 when he attached it to the nib, which is pretty cool. Now, I don't know the full history of iridium and iridium tips, and I don't think it's all that well documented, but obviously sometime in the 18th century, they figured out how to alloy iridium with other elements as they discovered them to lower the cost of the iridium tips that were going on these nibs. And it seems to me that because these pens started off with 100% iridium and they slowly phased out iridium, the name iridium point pretty much just stuck, even though that iridium at one point was pretty much phased out altogether, and that's why it's still called iridium, even though there's no iridium in them. So that brings me to modern fountain pens, because I really do want to find out what these fountain pen manufacturers are using today. So I had a look at a few manufacturers' websites, and some do list what they make their fountain pen nibs from, and some don't. So I had a look at Harris, which do state the composition of some of their nibs, and one of their nibs is made up of a composition of tungsten and ruthenium, tungsten being about $43 a kilo, so much cheaper than osmium, rhodium, or iridium. And another one of their nibs is also made up of a mixture of ruthenium and osmium. And it makes sense that these guys are using tungsten nowadays. As I said before, tungsten is very, very cheap compared to the other alternatives. It's $43 a kilo compared to hundreds of dollars per ounce. And as well as that, it is very comparable in hardness to iridium and osmium. It's certainly much harder than steel. And as well as that, it is very, very stable at room temperature, which means it's not going to oxidize when it's in contact with ink for long periods of time. So that brings me into a little bit of speculation, because I do want to figure out what these Chinese fountain pen makers are using for their really cheap Chinese nibs. Now, yes, I did say they are using tungsten for the higher end fountain pens, but they're also mixing it with, what did I say, ruthenium, and ruthenium is $200, $300 an ounce. And knowing the cheap Chinese fountain pen manufacturers, there is no way that they would even think of using ruthenium in their fountain pen nibs. And these guys cut corners at every cost. So I have two ideas about what they might be using in these nibs. So my first speculation is that they're using tungsten carbide, and tungsten carbide is tungsten, so it's a very cheap material, but it's also mixed with carbon in a lattice structure, and this stuff is stupidly hard. This is the stuff that they use in drill bits, milling cutters, and lathe inserts. So this stuff can resist pretty much any abrasion, and it's also used in the balls in ballpoint pens, which also have to resist quite a fair amount of abrasion. And the thing is, this stuff is very cheap, and my theory is that they just buy a whole bunch of balls that is supposed to be used in ballpoint pens, and they just weld these on to the end of the nibs, and pretty much that's it. Grind it down to shape, and no one could tell the difference because it's a stupidly hard material. So my second theory is that they're using some form of stainless steel in their nibs, at least for the really cheap fountain pen nibs that they're cranking out by the thousand. And the reason why I edge towards stainless steel rather than tungsten carbide is they also use stainless steel balls in ballpoint pens, which means they also could buy a whole bunch of balls that were meant for ballpoints and just tack them onto the nib. But stainless steel is certainly going to be a lot cheaper than tungsten carbide, and while it is a stupidly hard metal, it's also going to be much easier to grind and much faster to grind, and obviously a lot cheaper to grind than tungsten carbide, which means that if you're going to try and cut costs, you're going to use stainless steel. But those are my theories. If anyone knows definitively what they're using in these nibs, certainly do tell me in the comments. If I've missed something out, please do tell me in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.